Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
This is Pod Save the World Insomnia Edition.
Yeah.
We're both feeling our best today.
Yep. I've had a day, man.
Some early wake-ups, quite a day. It's also weird to talk to you about foreign policy when there's so much dysfunction happening in Washington. I'm really upset with both sides. I'm just kidding.
Well, I mean, the intangible point is when the United States is a complete train wreck at home, like our capacity to conduct a competent foreign policy, which is already difficult, is like when you can't raise the debt ceiling, how are you going to navigate a multilateral China strategy? You
can't pay your bills. Yeah, it would be nice if we could go to India and China and say, hey, look at this giant investment we just made in renewable energy.
Yes, that would be useful before the Glasgow conference that's intended to save the world from impending climate disaster.
But lots of big news in the world, Ben. We're going to talk about the German election results. Big hearings today in the Senate on Afghanistan. There was a wild report over the weekend about the Trump administration's plans to arrest, maybe kill, Wikileaks founder Julian Assange. Super fucked up. Big foreign policy votes on the Hill last week. Update on Burma, hacking for hire, and then some fun-ish, I guess, anecdotes about Trump in foreign policy in a new book. All right, so let's start with these German elections because it's a big deal.
Yeah.
Germans went to the polls on Sunday. They're going to decide, a lot of them voted by mail, but they're going to decide their country's political future after 16 years with Angela Merkel as chancellor. There's not a new chancellor yet for reasons we'll explain, but here's what we do know, Ben. The center-left Social Democratic Party got the most votes with 25.7%. Merkel's conservative Christian Democratic Union Party got about 24%. The Greens got 14.8%. A pro-business party called the Free Democrats got 11.5%. And the scary, shitty right-wing AfD party got 10.3%. So what does that all mean? It means the Social Democrats, who are sort of center-left, and the Green Party did quite well. Both gained between 5 and 6% from the last election. It means that Merkel's party and her successor, this guy Armin Laschet, got crushed. They lost nearly 9% since the last election. Remember that he was the guy who got caught laughing at a memorial service.
Not good.
Yeah, you suggested at the time that was not smart. I think that
neither was dealing with the floods in catastrophic ways.
Yeah, it was an impressive call. So, and also, while it's not great that the AfD party, this right-wing party, got double-digit support, they did lose about 2% from the last election. So I guess we should all feel better about that. And it kind of tracks with Marine Le Pen's election dip in France.
Yeah, and what we should feel good about, too, is when Merkel, in the boldest move of her tenure, took in 1 million refugees, largely Syrian, in 2015, everybody said, oh, this is going to drive them to the far right, and that just hasn't really happened. If anything, and we can talk about it, but this election seems to indicate a move to the left.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So before we get to this next chancellor question, I'm going to try to quickly explain how German elections work. So every 4 years, Germans over 18, you cast 2 votes. The first is for your local representative. The second is for a party. And you can split those votes if you want, which in America would seem weird, but in a system with like 5 different parties is not as strange as it might sound. The top vote getter in each district for that first vote gets a seat in parliament. But here's where it gets confusing. The overall makeup of parliament has to be proportional to that second vote's result. So if the Greens got 50% of the second vote, they would need to have 50% of the seats in the Bundestag, which is very fun to say. The way you make that math work out is by granting parties more seats until the proportions work out. So the size of the Bundestag itself, the number of seats, fluctuates, which just blows my mind. In 2017, there were 709 members. Imagine being Pelosi trying to whip an ever-changing 709 member.
Well, if they're very reasonable Germans, so I mean,
it's probably not a lot of mansion cinemas.
Not a lot of tea parties. Yeah.
So I'll spare you the additional details. Crazy system. What happens now is all the parties get together, they negotiate to see who can build a coalition that represents a majority in the Bundestag and decide who is chancellor. This is going to take a bit. In 2017, it took 5.5 months. So Ben, with those confusing basics completed, any big takeaways from you about what this election result means for Germany and their leadership role in Europe?
My main takeaways are that, number one, like Germany's had a very dominant figure in its politics for 16 years, and it's going to take, this election is not resolving kind of someone ascending to the position of chancellor who's going to have the same clout within German politics or even within Europe itself. And so when I was there for 8 years, Angela Merkel was the kind of first port of call in Europe, on everything. She was the person who could kind of marshal collective action in Europe on the financial crisis, on the refugee crisis, on any number of issues. The second point is that this is a noticeable shift or tack somewhat left. I mean, it's not an overwhelming result, and it's still clearly a fairly centrist kind of country, but
it's like 40%.
Yeah,
Greens
the
and Social
SPD,
Democrats,
the Social Democrats and the Greens clearly are the ones that picked up and that improved their standing, and I think that that's representative of a natural correction from 16 years of kind of center right, all the very centrist kind of governance, and also in the Green movement, this kind of increasing focus on climate change, and so then the most likely coalition, it will probably be one that has the Social Democrats and the Greens together with the FDP, which is this kind of libertarian party that has always kind of been around German politics. Actually sponsored a trip that Josh Earnest and I took in 2005.
How was that?
Across Germany. It was great. We got to drink a lot of beer and meet a lot of Germans. But I digress. The FDP has a history of being a coalition partner.
Have you seen these sketches where they have names for these potential coalitions? They call it the traffic light, because it'd be like red, yellow, green, like the SPD, the FPD, the Green Party. It's very funny. The Jamaica coalition. Yeah, it's very funny.
Yeah, I know. The colors, it's like a soccer team or something.
Yeah.
But I mean, it seems like that would be the most likely result but yeah, I think within Germany that means, probably more consensus-based, governance, although Merkel is definitely consensus-based, but with the needle pointed a little bit more to the left. And in Europe, I think that means, less of a German-centered EU set of policies than has been the case under Merkel. And Macron, particularly if he's reelected, will probably be trying to kind of throw his weight around in Europe. But inevitably, that all kind of sorts itself out as kind of the big European powers, in some fashion, kind of setting the pace.
Yeah. So I know you're a Merkel fan. I think we've sung her praises on this show before. Obama was a huge fan too. But I did want to get your reaction to some criticism of her from this recent Atlantic piece I read. The title was "The World Won't Miss Angela Merkel." It was by Yasha Monk. The gist of the argument is, look, Merkel is going to be replaced by a moderate. We might get a slightly more progressive sort of status quo or coalition. So there probably won't be major changes, even though she's gone now. And then the piece specifically criticizes Merkel for two things. The first is basically fighting for austerity and cuts after the financial crisis instead of bailing out the countries that needed bailouts or kicking them out of the EU, just sort of bumping along for a decade. And the second and third order effects that arose from that. The second argument was when Viktor Orban was first elected, the EU could have imposed sanctions on Hungary, checked him early, but Merkel opposed taking meaningful steps to hold Orban accountable and allowed his party to remain a member of the Christian Democratic faction in the European Parliament. The piece also criticizes her record on accepting Syrian refugees and sort of suggests that it wasn't all she said it was, but I found that hard to stomach or believe, to be honest. What do you make of those criticisms, sir?
I entirely share parts of them. The fact that Germany has been a restraining force from kind of utilizing the EU's power to sanction or curb the excesses of Viktor Orban in Hungary or the Law and Justice Party in Poland is certainly the case. Orban, his corruption benefits enormously from EU funds. So they get billions of dollars to build roads and stuff. And he notoriously kind of skims off the top and enriches a bunch of cronies with that money. And the EU just keeps the spigot on. And, with Merkel, I think it's number one, she was so focused on holding the EU together that she didn't want to do something that could push somebody out. But also, her Christian Democratic Union shares some overlap with Orban's kind of right-wing Christian party, Fidesz. So I think that's an entirely appropriate criticism. I think austerity. Look, Obama had this argument with her, from the first G20. I don't know if you remember. Where we were going saying now is not the time for austerity. Now is the time to spend some money and stimulate the economy and strengthen safety nets. But I think on
that was annoying. The whole trip was annoying.
It was annoying, and so we had a philosophical difference with Merkel on that. I do think on that front, she's pretty reflective of Germans. They're pretty prudent. They're pretty fiscally responsible. And where I'd push back and defend her is, look, she's a small C conservative, right? So I don't share all of her politics. But she was willing unlike almost every other leader that I encountered, she was willing to do politically unpopular things that she thought were right. So even on the austerity piece, Germany, we were constantly pressing them to do more to kind of help bail out Greece and Southern Europe. And she never went quite as far as we wanted, but she went farther than the German people wanted. And that kind of held the Eurozone together. Again, most famously on the refugee thing, that was not in her political interest. And there have been very few occasions in the last couple decades where political leaders did things that were politically damaging because she thought it was right. And they did take in 1 million refugees, and they have done a good job at absorbing that refugee population. And so I do think that look, everybody should be criticized. On balance, if you look at the totality of her tenure, she was the center that held in Europe, and she was the center that held through the financial crisis, and she was the center that kind of held through Trump. And yes, I don't always like that the center is further to the right than I'd like, but man, wouldn't you like to have Angela Merkel as your right of center party in the United States? You know?
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh God, yeah. Speaking of leaders getting a lot of criticism, there were some big hearings in the Senate on Tuesday, Ben, where Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, Mark Milley, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and Frank McKenzie, who's the head of Central Command and sort of the de facto leader in Afghanistan for the U.S. military, were pressed a lot on Afghanistan. So the biggest headline coming out of the day that I've seen so far is that Chairman Milley and General McKenzie said it was their personal opinion that the U.S. should have kept 2,500 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, and presumably they provided that advice to Biden in various situation or meetings. That seemed to contradict what President Biden said in an ABC News interview last month. Let's listen to that.
Your top military advisors warned against withdrawing on this timeline. They wanted you to keep about 2,500 troops.
No, they didn't. It was split. That wasn't true. That wasn't true.
They didn't tell you that they wanted troops to stay?
No, not in terms of whether we were going to get out in a time frame, all troops. They didn't argue against that.
So no one told, your military advisors did not tell you, no, we should just keep 2,500 troops. It's been a stable situation for the last several years. We can do that. We can continue to do that.
No one said that to me that I can recall.
Reporters are calling out what seems like an obvious
inconsistency
there, which was these generals saying, we said, keep 2,500 troops. Biden saying, no, they didn't. What Biden's team is saying, Jen Psaki, Kate Bedingfield, are saying that Biden's argument was, no, the advice was split. Different military leaders offered different advice. But also that none of his military leaders said you could maintain stability at the 2,500 troop level without a return to direct conflict. So the point being, there was this status quo and a ceasefire against U.S. forces from the Taliban based on the deal Trump cut. If you left 2,500 troops in forever, the Taliban starts attacking us again. There's no status quo. I don't know. It's a rough soundbite for Biden. Look, I know what they're saying. It's a complicated issue.
Yeah, but when I heard that at the time, I thought,
me too.
This is coming.
I was like,
all
those generals argued for more troops.
Yeah, because again, 8 years in the White House, there was never one occasion in which a general didn't argue to keep troops in Afghanistan or add more troops. Like
literally.
So when he said that, I thought at the time that what he meant is that there was no dissent on kind of like once he decided to withdraw, like the pace of it or something. Something was just off in that exchange, and you can. Because it was reported at the time that he made the decision that he overruled Austin and Milley, and there was even some kind of backgrounding from the White House to that effect. It felt like so. Look, we've worked for a politician who every now and then they say something you're like, that's not
sort of garbled.
It's kind of garbled, and but there's no surprise that he overruled the military in the withdrawal like that. That, I think, has been kind of priced into my understanding of the situation from the very beginning.
Me too. Interestingly, Milley later seemed to concede that even keeping 2,500 troops wouldn't have created a durable Afghan army, a durable Afghan government, that the final outcome would have been basically the same. So, I think that is sort of the big picture point. General McKenzie also said that Trump's peace deal with the Taliban was, quote, the primary accelerant to lowering morale and general efficiency of the Afghan military, something we've heard before. Secretary Austin pushed back on the idea that you heard in a lot of right-wing circles that it was a disaster to close Bagram Air Base. We should have held on to it during the evacuation. Austin told senators it would have required sending an additional 5,000 troops to Afghanistan to keep Bagram open and not helped with the evacuation efforts. There were a lot of important conversations about the withdrawal, the future of Afghanistan, the presence of ISIS, Al Qaeda. But it does seem like this will mostly just be used as fodder to, try to dry out inconsistencies. I know you watched some of these hearings. You were up early. Any big takeaways?
Yeah, I mean, I thought Lloyd Austin at the beginning and at times throughout the hearing acknowledged like the failure of certain aspects of U.S. strategy in Afghanistan over the years in ways that I don't know if I've ever heard like a sitting military leader do. That the model for how we built the security forces was flawed, that we couldn't kind of forge a nation. So to me, that was an interesting, moment in American kind of military history that, like, for my experience of the U.S. military, and certainly when you and I were there, Tommy, was like a belief in, the rightness, for instance, of counterinsurgency strategy or the viability of building massive security forces like this. And it did feel to me like in a healthy way, there was some acceptance of and some learning of lessons. I mean, about that. Maybe we shouldn't have tried to build an army kind of in the image of our own army. Maybe it needed to be something different in Afghanistan. And then Milley, I think, on the kind of Woodward stuff was kind of interesting in defending what he did and, kind of identifying, what he believes the responsibilities of a military officer are, which are, yes, to the chain of command, but also there's kind of like a set of kind of values and, kind of there's like a higher duty essentially to the Constitution.
Yeah, Milley was sitting there thinking, I should not have had the soup. This has created a lot of problems.
Yeah.
This Bob Woodward interview.
You should listen to Dan, man.
Yeah, listen to Dan.
Milley had a lot of soup.
General Milley.
Yeah.
Did you happen to listen to the New York Times The Daily episode today?
No.
This is they interviewed Sami Sadat, who is like the Special Forces Commander General in Afghanistan. It was a really interesting interview because Sadat actually said that he left Afghanistan in June, and he's someone who grew up born in Afghanistan. The Taliban take over, lived through that with like 5 sisters who were brutally repressed by the Taliban, couldn't go to school, anything else. But then he eventually said he couldn't support the Ghani government, so he left the country in June, and then came away feeling like ultimately the Taliban taking over was better for the majority of people in Afghanistan because, kind of like that New Yorker piece we talked about, like at least people in villages aren't getting killed by airstrikes right now, even if you can't listen to music, the Taliban's repressive, et cetera. It's just a very interesting perspective that you don't hear very often. Yeah,
I mean, I think that the cost and consequence of the actual war, is often the Taliban rule is not measured against that. It's measured against what we were trying to achieve there,
Yes.
And again, that doesn't make it any easier for the Afghans who are under Taliban rule. But it does remind us that the kind of state of war is not like in Washington. It used to bother me that like there was some equation between the presence of American forces and even in a war as that's a stabilizing thing for people. And I mean, if you look at the countries where we've been fighting these wars, like they are not stable places.
Yeah, no, that's right. And then, of course, the Taliban, they've completely locked women out of the government. They are oppressing students.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of reports of atrocities. Like the horrible things are happening, but it was just, an interesting interview to hear on balance.
What'll be interesting to watch is if things are relatively calm in terms of there not being a war, like does there start to be internal pressures on the Taliban from a population that is more educated, that had a taste of democracy, that had women who were able to go to school? That would be the hope, right?
Yeah,
is that there's some internal pressure that builds up.
And hopefully that some sort of diplomatic effort can help push that as well. So, Ben, over the weekend, Yahoo News published this wild story about the Trump administration and WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Here's some big takeaways. First, Mike Pompeo, failed Secretary of State.
And failed CIA director.
Failed CIA director. Yeah. He apparently advocated for kidnapping Assange from the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where he was living at the time, and then either rendering him to a third country to be interrogated, that worked out well in the past, or turning him over to the British government. I think the Brits said, absolutely not, you are not doing this on our territory. The report also said that at one point Trump's team got wind that the Russians were planning to get Assange and move him to Moscow, presumably, and the CIA started preparing all these options to prevent that from happening, including, quote, potential gun battles with Kremlin operatives on the streets of London and shooting out the tires of a Russian plane carrying Assange.
Yeah.
A few too many Bourne movies
exactly,
there.
Yeah.
Yahoo also reported that President Trump actually asked about whether the CIA could assassinate Assange and wanted to see options for how it could happen. Lots of people in the story poo-pooing it, saying, oh, he wasn't serious. It was Trump being Trump. But it's kind of serious when the president says that. It also details debates during the Obama and Trump administrations about how to classify WikiLeaks, and even some of the journalists who worked with WikiLeaks, like Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras. Some intelligence officials wanted to call them information brokers rather than journalists so that they could more aggressively spy on them. The Obama administration rejected that idea, but spying on WikiLeaks got more and more aggressive over time, especially during the Trump administration. So it's a long story worth reading in full. Ben, you and I dealt with like the early days of WikiLeaks together, the first sort of tranche of cables and things. But I was long gone when Edward Snowden emerged and when these
Lucky you.
Big time. More intense debates happened. Like, what do you make of this reporting? And like, I don't know, when does Congress haul Pompeo's ass up to the Hill to testify about this?
Yeah, I mean, there are two pieces of this. Like, the reporting is terrifying and it's awful, and they should never have been considering doing these things. And look, they did. I mean, they assassinated Qasem Soleimani, and Pompeo loves to crow about that. I mean, again, not a good guy by any stretch of the imagination, but their willingness to kind of push extrajudicial kind of actions around individuals, was not limited to this. By the way, best detail in the story was that there was like a period of time when everybody within like a couple block radius of the Ecuadorian embassy where Assange was hiding out, they said every single person there was like either a Russian American or British intelligence operative. Like even like the cleaning people, like the woman pushing the baby in the carriage, like
bunch of guys with Russian accents, like reading newspapers on the bench.
Yes, that was good.
Very subtle.
But to me, like there was it speaks to kind of like a, I said this to you, Tommy, you and I were going back and forth about this, like there were a series of leaks and stuff that it was always like the end of the world. This is like the worst leak in the history of leaks. That happened like a lot during the Obama years. It continued under the Trump years, apparently. And this kind of desire for like vengeance is an unhealthy impulse for a security service, an intelligence service. And I remember Pompeo at the time referring to them as like a foreign adversary or something. And everybody knew then it was kind of weird. I will say on Assange, like I have no sympathy for this guy beyond obviously thinking that he, like any individual, should not be targeted in this fashion. So, but my assessment of him and I'll get people adding me and Glenn Greenwald, but like the Russia thing, this is not a conspiracy theory. There is a report that we can all read, the conclusion of exhaustive investigation that like the Russian GRU like directly provided WikiLeaks with the emails that they leaked. So they were at least an unwitting vessel for Russian intelligence operations. Like, and that's problematic. It's hard to deal with that. I think people should recognize that journalists sometimes are unwitting too, like of where information might have come from that reaches them. So this is like an ethical challenge when you have a group like WikiLeaks that kind of embraces the values of journalism, but clearly engages in kind of guerrilla leaking, sometimes on behalf of quite bad actors, right? And so I don't find Assange to be a particularly sympathetic character, even. But I do on the sense that nobody should be subject to what the CIA was apparently contemplating doing.
I think this quote really like summed it up well for me. For a former Trump national security official, the lessons of the CIA's campaign against WikiLeaks are clear. Quote, there was an inappropriate level of attention to Assange given the embarrassment, not the threat he posed in context.
And that should never happen.
So this was after the so-called Volt 7 leaks, which are like super sophisticated cyber tools. Yeah, and it just seemed like they were pissed. They were freaked out. They wanted vengeance. My views on WikiLeaks, Chelsea Manning, Assange, are like complicated and incoherent and have evolved over time. Like the way Chelsea Manning was treated by the military while she was in detention is horrific.
Yeah, and Obama commuted her sentence in part for that reason.
I don't think it's okay. Like some of the disclosures she released about, like the helicopter gunship video, like I do think that kind of information should be out. I don't think it's okay to dump 250,000 cables that you haven't read. I also don't think it was like a huge national security disaster like the government always acts it is. So again, like totally incoherent thoughts on this, but it's complicated.
The coherence like that I might try to grope for here, acknowledging how complicated it is I did feel and see them kind of evolving, right? So our first interaction with them was their leaks were focused on Iraq and Afghanistan, and that's the stuff that Chelsea Manning provided, some of it. And that did feel more whistleblower-ish.
Yeah,
it was like we're revealing kind of abuse here. We're revealing the excesses of this military campaign. I think military contractors too. Okay, so that's...
And I think the Iraqi military and other,
Yeah, so that's where we start with them. Then we get to the cables. And I remember when chairing some meetings around that time, Tommy, where the scale of it is coming down on us.
It's like, what the
fuck? And part of me was like, there's something there's like a twisted genius behind this kind of mass transparency. What I've said to you in the past too, though, the problem with not looking at those cables in the same way that the Times or the Guardian did is that the names of civil society people meeting at the embassy, there weren't redactions, and that's shitty for those people. Suddenly their names out there meeting with the embassy. So then I start to be more concerned. Then by the end of the Obama years, they're releasing John Podesta's emails, which is not providing any public service, other than to the Trump campaign. I felt like they lost their credibility as a truth to power transparency organization. There frankly wasn't much transparency objective served in dumping all the Clinton campaign emails out. That was serving a very direct political interest in the United States. And,
I mean, right, like the DNC ones, you could argue, well, it showed that, sort of the primary process seemed rigged to some people. I think that's a fair argument. But back to the State Department cables. I mean, if the ambassador to France meets with someone, they have a conversation that's secret, they classify it, they send it back. If you release that, that's not whistleblowing. You can do it. You could say there should be more transparency. We classify too many things. Happy to talk about that because I'm likely to agree with you, but it's not whistleblowing.
Well, think about it this way. There's a difference between what Chelsea Manning thought she was doing, whether it was legal or, appropriate, people can debate, but versus what the GRU was doing.
Right.
You know what I mean? She, I think, believed that she was trying to bring some information to light. The GRU wasn't trying to serve the interest of transparency by giving a bunch of emails to WikiLeaks.
Yeah, and Snowden was trying to talk about bulk surveillance.
Yeah.
And again, I think there's an important conversation that was had at that. Okay, so we solved that one. So Ben, there were a bunch of interesting votes on foreign policy last week on Capitol Hill that I think are worth mentioning. I think they're doing the NDAA, right? Like the big defense financing bill. So the first was a dust up over an amendment to provide another $1 billion in new funding to Israel to pay for interceptor missiles for their Iron Dome missile defense system. That's the system that very recently knocked down thousands of rockets from Gaza, from Hamas. It's a very effective system. It's been funded by the U.S. That amendment ended up passing overwhelmingly. It was a margin of 420 to 9 opposed in the House, but it was only after progressives expressed enormous frustration at the process the funding request went through, or really the lack thereof. There wasn't really a traditional process. And generally speaking, the lack of willingness to talk about how U.S. assistance, military assistance to Israel can continue what AOC called, quote, persistent human rights abuses against the Palestinian people. That was in her statement explaining her vote. Second, there was a bill from Congressman Ro Khanna to end logistical and intelligence support to Saudi Arabia in Yemen for the war in Yemen, and that passed by a vote of 219 to 207. If that language ends up in the final National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA bill, and Biden signs it, it will essentially end the U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen. So a lot of activists have been frustrated that President Biden announced that he would end supporting offensive military operations from Saudi in Yemen, but he has not done more to end the Saudi blockade of Yemen.
Yeah.
And some would argue that the Saudi-led war in Yemen is essentially, it's entirely an offensive operation.
Yeah.
So any support you provide them is helping there. So Jake Sullivan, Trump's. Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor, is visiting Saudi Arabia and the UAE this week. Hopefully he gets to fondle that big orb that they rolled out for Trump.
Yes.
Let's pause there, Ben. So 2 interesting fights for progressives, this Iron Dome funding one and the Yemen one. One, I feel like we made a lot of progress. One, not so much.
Yeah.
What's your take?
I mean, the Iron Dome thing was incredibly complicated, right? Because it's the most defensible, and sensible aspect of like our military assistance. It is defensive. It saves lives. When you and I have talked about conditioning aid, it's related to other types of military assistance used for offensive purposes, or the cost of the security around settlements and things like that. I think it's less about taking issue with the fact of funding Iron Dome. I think what progressives were frustrated by is kind of 2 things that are not going to go away. One, the prioritization of this. Like we are in a week when we got the debt ceiling and government, shut down, and the entire Biden agenda is hanging on a thread up there. And it reminded me of like in, because we talked about this on the pod way back when I joined in 2019, I think. I think S1, like the first bill the Senate took up was like an anti-BDS bill.
Oh, yeah.
And it was just kind of like, even if you oppose BDS, there's a debate about whether you need to legislate around speech. But like, is this really the top order of business? And so the speed with which Democratic leadership was pushing that forward, felt just kind of incongruous to the priorities of the caucus. And then I think there is another question that is a legitimate question around the degree of budgetary support we provide to the Israeli military when this is not like a poor country,
Yeah, they spent, I think, $20 billion in 2020 on their military.
In any other circumstance, we'd probably be discussing why we are cutting checks for all this stuff. Clearly that this was the worst vehicle to have this debate because it's a defensive system. So it was inevitably going to end like that. But again, it's a sign of just kind of a creeping discomfort. I don't want to overstate how widespread it was in this case because there's only 9 members, right? But I think everybody kind of knew that this kind of routinization of just shipping aid out the door and prioritizing these types of bills over kind of everything else is just something that doesn't feel right process-wise.
Yeah, and then in the attacks on the 9 members who dared to ask questions, who voted no.
Oh, over the top. Over the top.
The ADL tweeted this. Funding for Israel's Iron Dome may have passed yesterday, but 9 members of Congress voted no. No to helping Israel defend itself from rocket attacks from terrorists. No to protecting Israeli schools and hospitals and the civilians inside. No to saving innocent lives. Now, this was another billion on top of billions that had already been provided for the Iron Dome system. So they weren't saying no. They were, I think, trying to start a conversation about, okay, exactly how is this money going to be spent? I think
why this number? Where did $1 billion come from?
There was no line item.
Yeah, like what did And look, I think
they're doing their jobs.
Yeah, well, also like 9 people voted against this. There's this kind of overwhelming force that comes down on anybody that bucks the trend.
Dunking on them.
And like, so they voted against a package of military assistance. That doesn't mean they want people to die. I mean, if they had voted against a package of military assistance to any other country in the world, I don't think, that there would be this kind of response. And so all they were saying was really like, can we debate this?
Right.
Which is kind of what lawmakers want to do. On the Yemen thing, it's a hugely constructive step. And it's a sign that how positive it is for Congress to keep on an issue, right? Just because Biden made an announcement that we're ceasing the offensive support, like Ro Khanna, who's been a leader on this stuff, this is him saying, like, well, hey, we're holding you to that. Like, let's go here, And I wondered whether Jake's trip was like not entirely divorced from that vote, because it's a sign that useful pressure, even from friendly sources, right? Of like, hey, come on, we're nudging you guys. Like, this is dragging on. There's been a blockade that's caused terrible humanitarian consequences. So hopefully, this kind of expedites the cessation of U.S. support for this whole enterprise.
Yeah, 2 other sort of interesting points. Jamal Bowman, congressman from New York, proposed an amendment that would have required congressional approval to have U.S. troops in Syria 1 year after the measure became law. It failed, but he got 141 votes, which is interesting. So like seeming like maybe a similar slow building of pressure to get us out of Syria like we're seeing in Yemen. And then depressingly, Ben, the NDAA authorized more defense spending than Biden even asked for, $768 billion, which is $25 billion above what we requested. So that's just like, come on.
This is a huge failure, I think, of, there needs to be more of a focus on the bloated defense budget. It's absurd. And nobody knows what's in it. Anything that's cut is treated like we're going to be, the Chinese are going to be invading the United States next year. Terrorists will be running through our cities if we spend $10 billion less when we already spend more than like the next 15 nations combined, including China. And frankly, if you're looking at scarce resources and you're looking at how you're going to spend money to fight climate change and all these other things, you got to, the defense budget is a place to take from. And frankly, our security would be better served spending some of that money to deal with climate change, when you just do a threat assessment. So I was really disappointed to see that. I do want to just say one more thing about Yemen, which is there's something to the idea that the offensive distinction is, pretty difficult to draw because are we providing logistical support that's kind of like and refueling support and things that just kind of facilitate general military operations? Are we replenishing weapon stocks? Are we selling offensive military capability to the Saudis? There's a cutoff and then there's a gray space, and we seem to be in the gray space, even though the direction that Biden has set is far better than the direction that Trump set.
Yeah, and look, I think some military analysts would argue the same thing about Iron Dome, and that
they could.
There's really, at the end of the day, sort of no such thing as purely defensive or offense. It all kind of enables.
The argument that someone would make would be that giving them, and this is a difficult argument, giving them this defensive system makes it more likely that they engage in these offensive operations in Gaza. I still think on balance, there are rockets fired at Israelis, before the Gaza wars, and if we have a capacity to help them shoot rockets down that would kill civilians, that seems like the better use of our military systems.
I'm pro Iron Dome. A couple more things. I'll try to go a little faster because we're going long. So this story about Burma or Myanmar caught my eye, Ben. So a federal judge ordered Facebook to release records of Facebook accounts connected to anti-Rohingya violence in Burma. Facebook fought the release, saying it violated privacy law. The judge basically laughed at them in that argument, like, oh, you guys in privacy got it. So the Rohingya are a Muslim minority group in Burma. Back in 2017, more than 730,000 of them were driven out of Myanmar and into Bangladesh. There were widespread reports of war crimes and atrocities against the Rohingya by the military. There's an effort underway to prosecute Myanmar at the International Court of Justice at The Hague under the 1948 UN Convention on Genocide. UN human rights investigators say Facebook played a key role in spreading hate speech that fomented the violence against the Rohingya. More broadly, the military coup in I keep saying them interchangeably, Burma, Myanmar. More broadly, this military coup is ongoing. The crackdown against regular people is ongoing after, I think, 8 months. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights estimates that 1,100 protesters have been killed, but the United Nations just can't do anything about it. They're paralyzed because Russia and China sell the Burmese military a bunch of weapons, and they block any meaningful action at the Security Council. So basically, just wanted to bring the story up. We haven't talked about it in a while. Vent about Facebook for a minute because they're also being accused of allowing incitement on their platform in Ethiopia while blocking release of evidence about that same kind of deadly rhetoric and behavior in Burma, and it's infuriating.
So if you want to dip in the back catalog, the episode 4 of Missing America, my podcast I did with you guys, is all about disinformation and hate campaigns in Burma. And it was central. I mean, basically, there was a massive effort to gin up hate of the Rohingya, to kind of, there were conspiracy theories. There's, fake news about Rohingya men raping Buddhist women, things that kind of whipped the population into this frenzy. At the same time that this ethnic cleansing happened. And Facebook did nothing really, very little to curb this. And when I traveled to Myanmar to work on a story I was writing for The Atlantic, the Facebook had no employees in the country.
Yeah, they could barely read what was being written.
Yeah, they had 2 people who were in I think Singapore that came once or twice a year, mainly to make sure that the government let Facebook be there. They just didn't seem to care, that this was happening. And to me, like the long pole in the tent here is liability. That like essentially, this is an important step towards trying to set a precedent that Facebook has some responsibility. And I think, with government regulation, it should be legal responsibility for things like whether or not like an ethnic cleansing campaign is being orchestrated on their platform. And I think that, the Times did a good investigation that identified that the Burmese military was behind a lot of this hate campaign. So yeah, it's a positive step forward.
Yeah, release the documents, guys. Another update, because I'm basically all out of questions about this subject for you. So the Washington Post reported that the CIA recalled its Vienna station chief because of inattention to cases of so-called Havana syndrome. Havana syndrome is this mysterious illness that seems to manifest as headaches, nausea, like a traumatic brain injury, and has reportedly afflicted around 200 U.S. intelligence officers or diplomats or others serving abroad. Congress has now authorized money for treatment. Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, reportedly met with a bunch of State Department officials who have been suffering from the disease. There were reports that a staffer who traveled with CIA Director Bill Burns on a trip to India came down with symptoms. That was weird. David Cohen, the CIA's deputy director, said the agency is getting closer to figuring out what's happening, but not close enough yet to make a sort of analytical judgment or a public judgment. So scary stuff.
It is, and it's important to keep checking in because this keeps popping up. And look, they need to, what I hope they're doing is like that. There's a clear someone is in charge of this, because it kind of felt like definitely the Trump years and into the beginning of Biden, because they're just getting into their offices and stuff. Like, didn't feel like someone owned this in a clear way in the U.S. government. I think it does, as I've said. We need some answers here. Like this is a weird thing to just kind of be a part of the backdrop.
Yeah, yeah, it would freak me the fuck out.
And tell us what you know and don't know. Because the workforce of these places is worried. I mean, I talk to diplomats, I talk to intelligence people. Like, people are worried, and they want some additional information or some degree of assurance.
Yeah, and I think they want to feel listened to and not treated like they're, these are just symptoms that they're manifesting out of stress. I mean, look, those kinds of things have happened before, but so many people are suffering from this syndrome now that it's,
Oh, and I talked to, some cases are that, someone had something else, like they had food poisoning or that.
Right.
But clearly some of these cases are because of something that is being done to people. Just the scale of this suggests that.
Yeah. Another issue we talked about a couple of times is this growing spy software for profit industry. So the industry leader is a company called the NSO Group. Good for them, industry leader. Great Yelp reviews. It was started by a bunch of former Israeli intelligence people. They claim this software is only used to track bad guys. That is bullshit. The Pegasus spy software that they created keeps showing up on devices used by journalists and human rights activists. The latest story that we wanted to highlight is of a woman named Ala al-Siddiq. This is according to a great report in The Guardian. So she was the executive director of ALQST. It's a nonprofit advocating for human rights in the UAE and the Middle East. She tragically died in a car accident in June, but a recent examination of her phone found that she had been hacked by the government, a government client of the NSO Group back in 2015. So Ben, I know you flagged this story. Maybe this will come up on Jake Sullivan's trip to the UAE, because
I would hope so.
I mean, constantly.
If you read the story too, like what it speaks to is that she felt like she was being surveilled.
Yeah.
And she was afraid and kind of, paranoid with good reason. And some of her friends kind of suggested that might have contributed to what happened to her. And look, it's a reminder that like if the Yelp reviews, would be like, 5 stars V Orban or
Mohammed bin Salman
at MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, like in the UAE. The UAE puts on a huge, show to the West about how much more kind of modern and in some ways liberal they are. And if you travel through Abu Dhabi, that's what you experience. But this is a reminder that there's like a very dark autocratic undercurrent, even harassing female human rights activists outside the country in places like London. And I think any analysis of stuff like Pegasus and NSO, there's like a lot of traffic that runs through Saudi UAE, you know? And so to me, this story is worth flagging, both to honor the courage of activists from those places, but also to kind of be the reminder that like, there's a nexus here of, that runs through the Gulf and Hungary and Russia that, that is uncomfortable because it's It's not far away. This is happening in London. It's happening in Washington, I'm sure. It's happening on our countries.
Yeah. Muhammad gave Pegasus 5 bone saws in his
yeah.
review. So let's end with a little more Trump book news. It's given us so much lately, Ben. So the latest book is from Stephanie Grisham. She worked on the Trump campaign. Then she was Melania's press person. Then she was the first White House press secretary in history who never held a White House briefing.
When they said this book was coming out, by the way, I didn't remember who she was. And it's pretty extraordinary that I forgot the name of someone who was like press secretary for like a year or two or something.
Right. I mean, because saying you're the press secretary without briefing is like saying you're a teacher, but you've never stepped foot in the classroom. It's like core to what you do.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the book has some anecdotes about foreign policy that I thought we could end with. So the first is about Russia and Trump and Putin. So, quote, with all the talk of sanctions against Russia for interfering in the 2016 election and for various human rights abuses, Trump told Putin, okay, I'm going to act a little tougher with you for a few minutes, but it's for the cameras. And after they leave, we'll talk. You understand? Grisham writes, recalling a meeting between the two leaders during the Group of 20 summit in Osaka in 2019. So basically Trump saying, hey, man, I'm about to sound tough. It's just for the press.
But wait, like my reaction to that was like, I don't recall him sounding tough for the press, like
that's a good point.
If the delta was like, this is me being really tough, and then what happens in closed doors is me cozying up to you, like, man, he must have been cozying up in private, because I don't really remember a tough message at the Osaka G20.
Ironically, point Trump team who are pushing back hard on this book, because you're right, that makes no sense. Here's the second Russia anecdote. So, quote, as the meeting began, Fiona Hill leaned over and asked me if I'd noticed Putin's translator, who's a very attractive brunette woman with long hair, a pretty face, and a wonderful figure, Grisham writes. She proceeded to tell me that she suspected the woman had been selected by Putin specifically to distract our president. Now, that checks out.
That 100% checks out, and I will say that I was in a bunch of meetings with Putin, and nobody who fit that description, let's just say, was translating. It was like stern Russian men.
Clear, ex-KGB person.
Yeah, exactly.
Grisham says that a trip to North Korea inspired Mr. Trump to ask her to research ways the press could be permanently evicted from the James S. Brady briefing room. That's kind of funny.
Yeah, that's just kind of funny.
I mean,
and not surprising in the slightest.
Not at all. This is my favorite, Ben. Miss Grisham reserves special ire for Jared Kushner, whom she calls Rasputin in a slim-fitting suit.
That's a very, look, I'll give this one entirely over to Miss Grisham. That's a very apt description of Jared. The slim-fitting suit somehow contributed to the Rasputin vibe, because he was like that, wealthy son of a real estate developer guy who like thinks he's cool because he gets like a slim cut suit or something. Give me a break, Jared, with that. You're not like you are what you are, which is someone who's like basically had a checkbook behind you your whole life. Yeah. And now you're like utilizing your position of power and influence to service your own personal ends. Like, good description there.
So I don't know a ton about Rasputin. I guess he was sort of like a Russian mystic, and he sort of advised the czars. But apparently his scandal, this is according to Wikipedia, so deep research.
I'm actually done some deep dives on Rasputin.
So did he help discredit the czarist government, and when he was died, led to the Romanovs?
Yeah, so basically he was this kind of mystic guy, con man, grifter, right? So he was a grifter. It was all about...
He owned real estate.
Yeah, well, not real estate, but it was all about like advancing his own personal
He owned the New York
Observer. Yeah, exactly. And he like could comfort the Tsar and Tsarina's child was like a hemophiliac, and he could comfort him, and that gave his influences principally with the Tsar's wife, and this was a source of building resentment around the royal family and Petersburg, and they killed this guy as kind of like one of the early acts of what became the Russian Revolution. But what he has in common with Jared is he did not wear slim fit suits, as I understand, but he was entirely like a grifter, power behind the throne kind of guy,
Yeah, I love it. All right, okay. So maybe that was a point, Grisham.
And shout out, by the way, to fellow podcaster Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast, which is why I've recently been immersed in Rasputin's story.
I'll check that out. Also, great show on Hulu called The Great, which is about Tsarist Russia.
That's a good show. Although it's funny, it's like one of those like shows you put on, you're like, oh, I'm gonna watch this period drama, and like there's just like orgies.
Yeah, it gets raunchy real fast.
Yeah, it gets real fast. There's like a lot of sex. And,
Yeah,
you know,
I was
like,
not expecting
I didn't
the
want to
tone.
watch it with my parents. You know, I watched The Crown with my parents.
Yes, yes. Watch The Crown with your parents. Watch The Great with someone, not them.
I do want to say to you, Tommy, I heard your joke on Pod Save America about a two-bill solution.
Thank you.
And I was like literally like guffawing. I think guffaw, right? Is that and the fact that neither Jon or Jon like even acknowledged your existence and the passing of that joke, I found kind of offensive on your part.
Look, first of all, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Second, Favreau, to his credit, did give me kind of like a like a look, like I heard what you did.
Okay,
Lovett
he saw you.
Lovett just ignored
Well,
it.
Lovett was plowing ahead to like his DLC kind of advice.
Yeah, Lovett was
Yeah.
plowing ahead.
Yeah.
To whatever he was going to say next.
Yeah, maybe he was threatened by the degree of humor and subtlety you brought to the
Thank
issue.
you.
Yeah,
I really appreciate that. You know, every once in a while, got to get a little world of life in there.
yeah, and there was a good clap back at Dan on Win the Future. I think at the end of that too. That was good. That's good. Dan, if you made it here,
yeah. Again, we respect you.
Yeah, we respect you.
All right, that's all we got this week.
Great.
Talk to you soon.
See ya.